It gives me enormous pleasure to welcome our first plenary speaker. Dr. Nayr Ibrahim is an associate professor of English subject pedagogy at Nord University in Norway. She has over 25 years of experience in English and bilingual education in Portugal, in Hong Kong, Cairo, Paris, and Norway. As a teacher, educator, materials writer, manager, and researcher. Nayr holds an MA in TEFL and a PhD in trilingualism, triliteracy, and identity from the University of Reading in the UK, and she specializes in early language learning with interest in bi- and multilingualism, multiple literacies, language and identity, learning to learn, children's voices, children's literature, and intercultural learning. Her book with Gail Ellis, Teaching Children How to Learn, Delta Publishing, won an award at the 2016 English Speaking Union English Language Awards in the category. Resources for Teachers, sorry. She has participated in EU projects on multilingualism, including reviewing the EU's key competencies for lifelong learning in 2018. And she is local coordinator for the Erasmus Plus project, IATEFL, and peer reviewer for the CLELA Journal. She's going to address a topic which, to many of us in the Global South, is really a key issue, where we are trying to expand the provisions for English language teaching to younger and younger ages. The title of her plenary is Reimagining and Reinventing Early Language Learning and Teaching. So I would like to ask you please to welcome Dr. Ibrahim to the stage.
It is a real pleasure to be here today, speaking to you at an opening plenary on young language learners. This is a win for children, and I'd like to thank all of those behind the scenes who actually made this happen. I, on the other hand, am merely a face in the journey that has taken a very short time to get where we are, yet it's been a journey full of twists and turns and uphills and downhills and potholes and lots of gap filling. So it is quite an honor to find myself at this crossroads in the journey, not only to be raising the status of teaching English to young language learners, to be representing the millions of children out there learning English in classrooms all over the world, but also to acknowledge and celebrate the work of so many teachers, researchers, scholars, educators that have actively and proactively contributed to positioning early English language learning as an area of study worthy of disciplinary scrutiny and rigor, but also a practice full of creativity, innovation, and passion. So, in my plenary, we're all together going on a metaphorical journey through the landscape of early language learning. In my abstract, I compared the unprecedented rise of teaching English to ever younger children to a runaway train. Because early language learning has been driven by forces that have had very little to do with what actually happens in the classroom with children. So in the space of these 50 minutes, let's stop, take stock, and reflect on how we got here. And I'll quote a 9-year-old child in Paris who said, "Looking back helps me look forward." And reimagine a new itinerary to teaching English to even younger children. So here we are at the train station, a crossroads in early language learning, and in the station there is a sofa. It's red, we're matching, right? It's the comfy, functional, well-designed, well-researched sofa of EFL, English as a Foreign Language, SLA, Second Language Acquisition, CLT, Communicative Language Teaching, ICC, not the Convention Centre, but Intercultural Communicative Competence. All key terms and concepts in foreign language research and teaching that have stood the test of time and contributed to a better understanding of how best to teach foreign languages. To adults. And this sofa has had to accommodate every kind of stakeholder in foreign language learning. The adult learner, the SLA researcher, the policymakers, the teacher trainers, the assessment organizations, the materials creators and the publishers. And hidden behind the sofa were the children, their teachers and their educators. So how did I get to sit on this sofa? Well, I'm going to look at the last 30 years in teaching English to children and younger learners, and what was actually happening around me as I was developing into a teacher of young learners. And I'm calling these momentous events in my EFL career stepping stones, as it has been an incremental process with support and scaffolding from many different corners of the EFL world. So I entered ELT in 1992, freshly arrived from South Africa in Portugal, with an honours degree in French and Portuguese language and literature and a sub-major in English literature. And I was literally thrown into this moving train, which was picking up speed, with the wrong ticket. I had a degree in literature, and I had a CELTA, emphasis on the A for adults. But I certainly didn't know children, and I was aware I was not qualified or willing to teach children. And the children knew I wasn't ready for them, and they ran rings around me. And I wonder how many teachers, you out there, were thrown into that moving train. Inexperienced, or even maybe experienced, not unqualified, but misqualified, feeling grossly inadequate, as not only were you positioned as a trained teacher with skills that were effectively wrong for the young learner classroom, but with the inevitable consequences on your professional identity. And we were teaching children, which at the time was an appendix to the real job of teaching adults, and was treated as the Cinderella area of not just scholarship, but of the profession in general. The 80s saw the dawning of the special interest groups at IATEFL, and the movers and shakers in the organization set up the first special interest group in young learners, the first SIG at IATEFL, that aimed at championing the teaching of young children. And as Sheila wrote in her history, Sheila Rickson wrote in her history of the YLT SIG article for the special Pearl Jubilee edition of the Young Learners and Teenagers SIG newsletter, edited by David Valent, young learners were about to come out from behind the sofa, smiling, happy, ready to play, because play is child's work. However, they were not sitting on the sofa yet. In 1998, I moved to Paris and joined what was called at the time the YLC, or the Young Learner Centre at the British Council. Now, this exclusive focus on teaching children and teenagers was the best training I had, together with a 30-hour course in teaching English to primary school children in Portugal, and the primary teacher training course in Paris, which ran for 20 years with Gail Ellis and Carol Reed. In the meantime, the rush to teach young learners was powered by the younger is better perspective, which has its beginnings in the critical period hypothesis, put forward by Eric Linneman in the 1960s, who explained that biological maturation guides language acquisition. So if you haven't learned your languages by the time you're a teenager, you can never attain native level mastery. But then, who cares? Hence, the age-old age debate in early language learning commenced. Another influence on the younger is better perspective was the fascinating research emerging from Canada on bilingual education and other English-speaking countries like the US and the UK, where children were learning English, where it was widely spoken in the community, so outside the classroom. Hence, daily exposure and interaction with other English speakers in real contexts contributed to very quick progress in language learning. But foreign languages are not learned in a natural environment. They're learned in a classroom. Foreign languages are not learned in the same way as a child learns a mother tongue or his first language. Children learning foreign languages already have experience with language. They do not come to our English classrooms as a clean slate. They come with developing linguistic knowledge. So like many teachers, I was caught up in this pull and push effect between mainstream EFL, which was about teaching adults, and the grassroots struggle to position early language learning as an area deserving to be looked at through a different lens. By that time, the Younger is Better chorus was getting louder and louder, and more children in primary schools were learning English. And here are some examples from my teaching contexts. And they're very different. In Norway, English had been in primary schools since the 1930s. Not officially, it depended on the municipality. In 1969, it was introduced officially into primary schools, and now, since 1997, children are learning English from grade 1. In France, where I spent 20 years, English was introduced into primary in 1989, and then starting from grade 1 in 2016. And in Portugal, where I started my EFL career, English had been in primary schools officially and unofficially since the 1980s, and was then introduced in grade 3, officially in 2015, so very different. In 2002, I started my master's degree. Now, searching for qualifications for teaching English to younger learners was not an easy feat, as there were none. So I decided to enroll in a master's in TEFL at the University of Reading and twisted the modules so that all of my assignments were based on research with children in my classes. I must have driven my tutors mad, as they were not YL experts, even though there was a young learner module. It was at that time and the subsequent years that I discovered the literature on teaching English to children, both at a theoretical and a pedagogical level. These are some of the seminal works that changed my life, and that made me love teaching children, that made me love teaching English to children, that gave me the confidence to walk into classrooms full of children eager to learn, and made me proud to be an English language teacher of children. Materials that gave me insight into child language development, age-related differences that impact on how children learn additional languages. the different levels of emotional, linguistic, cognitive, conceptual maturity that children bring to the classroom. Children are active learners, they are social learners, and learning starts with what the child already knows. Children are still learning how to learn, and they need explicit help in developing cognitive and metacognitive strategies that will help them to build the toolkit for learning, something teenagers and adults have already developed. The importance of the socio-affective domain, the relationship you build with children, the safe and stimulating environment that you create for the children are more important than teaching grammar and vocabulary. Teaching the whole child requires holistic approaches to learning, where the linguistic elements are integrated into meaningful tasks. The amount of scaffolding required to support, but also challenge the child to learn and motivate the child and to use its curiosity. And children are still learning, or in the process of learning, their own and their other languages. And children love the world of fantasy. And what better way to introduce that world than through children's literature? Now, as I continued to work on my master's, attempts to create young learner qualifications, such as the CELTIL, the Cambridge English Young Learner Extension to the CELTA, were unsuccessful. Not because they didn't exist, but because schools in the private sector did not require their teachers to have a qualification to teach young learners. So as demand was not created, so the courses were discontinued. And however, despite the shortage of qualified teachers, the lack of available qualifications, and the little understanding of how children learn additional languages, the numbers of children in primary classes learning English continue to grow, to the point where Johnson states in 2009, he describes this phenomenon as a truly global phenomenon and possibly the world's biggest policy development in education. In an EU survey of the Europeans and their languages in 2006, the majority of Europeans reported that they believed that the best age to start teaching both the first and the second language was in primary, from the age of 6. In other words, yes, very early on. And this is where parentocracy comes in, where the parents, eager to do the best for their children, become customers of these educational products, and they stormed that young learner train, and they colluded with the policymakers to make that train pick up speed. Simultaneously, another factor emerged to derail the train, the CEFR levels. Once again, created for learning, for adult learning, a much-needed framework for describing language ability in adult learning, which is good, but it was slapped on children learning languages at primary level and on published materials and tests. There are descriptors now for children and teenagers, but even the creators of those descriptors found it was not an easy task, because the CEFR is about language development, and teaching children is about cognitive and physical and socio-emotional as well as language development. And the CEFR does not cover those aspects of teaching and learning in young learner classrooms. But voices from the field were also becoming more audible, and research showing that earlier is not necessarily better increased. But can you see there's a young learner on the sofa already? After teaching all ages from age 4 to 17, in 2011, I started working on a PhD in multilingualism. Not English, but we'll get there in a minute. And the figures are mind-boggling. In Europe, All 27 EU countries had introduced a foreign language in primary, English being the most chosen language, and in some countries, 100% of children were learning English. In a matter of years, the trend soon translated into a figure reaching nearly 19 million children studying one or more foreign languages in 2013, which is nearly double that of 2003, according to Eurostat 2015. 84 countries in the world had lowered the age at which a foreign language is introduced from secondary to primary, according to UNESCO in 2012. And nearly all 42 Asian countries had made foreign language instruction to primary school children compulsory, with the majority of them aiming to develop proficiency in English. And the pull and push factor continued. Research study after research study, such as the ELI project in 2011, a longitudinal study partly funded by the European Commission and the British Council, including 7 countries. These studies were showing that younger is not better if, but there is a condition, if learning conditions are not in place. And what are these? Teacher supply, qualified teachers with an adequate language level of English, knowledgeable in developmentally appropriate practices, well-funded programs, dialogue between policymakers, teachers, educators, and researchers, small classes, more time for language learning in the curriculum, the out-of-school experience, because the amount of exposure to the target language in the child's surroundings has a large impact on learning, and just simply understanding the myriad of factors that impact on children's foreign language achievement. But by now, the younger is better view had become so entrenched, it was difficult to budge. Policymakers were not listening to the researchers, and the trend into primary continued, irrespective of what the research suggested. And as Janet Enever said, that horse had bolted. But the horse hadn't just bolted. It was galloping way over the hill, picking up speed, so we had better put on our trainers and start running and catching up with that horse. " 2014 was a watershed year. It was my first conference at IATEFL in Liverpool, and I loved it. My first research presentation at a conference in Umeå, Sweden, which resulted in my first research chapter, focusing on the development of a multilingual identity into pre-primary children. So can you see that even though we are still on the primary English journey, English is already seeping into the pre-primary years? But 2014 was a watershed moment, I think, in the early language learning journey. It was the year of the famous ELTJ debate at the IATEFL conference, with Janet Enever and Fiona Copland debating the motion, teaching English to children in primary schools does more harm than good. With Janet Enever's famous comment, "It's a done deal. It's over. We don't need to discuss that anymore." What we need, and what she urged us to do, was to concentrate on investigating the context of early language learning, with a view to improving approaches so that children and their teachers have good language experience inside and outside the classroom. It was also the year when the ELTJ published its special issue, Teaching English to Young Learners, with Gail Ellis's comment piece on young learners clarifying our terms. Now, I had been quite the little dictator in Paris, and I'm sure if my colleagues are here, they'll confirm, imposing a strict separation of levels based on the French educational system. So if a child was in primary, they would be in primary classes in the out-of-school context in the British Council. Later, the British Council also organized its courses into life stages, representing the different age ranges. This was followed by the reorganization of the YLT SIG newsletter into sections of interest for teachers: early years, primary, lower secondary, and upper secondary, thus acknowledging the differences in how children learn, how children and teenagers learn languages, and encouraging a focus on these differences. This change was instigated by David Valent, the outgoing coordinator, who has also been instrumental in professionalizing the profession. It was also the year in which the Early Language Learning Research Network was created, and at the moment we have about 170 researchers in different areas of early language learning, and is now about to become a fully independent research association called ELRA, or the Early Language Learning Research Association. So watch this space. It was also the year that Stephen May published his book, The Multilingual Turn in SLA, questioning the monolingual bias of the English-only approach. So the multilingual turn starts creeping into ELT, because English is not alone, and English should not be alone. So my PhD in multilingualism starts having some relevance. In 2016, I was invited to participate in an EU project for reviewing the key competencies for lifelong learning. Now, there are 8 competences, as you can see on the slide. So the expert panel had a mission to reassess the relevance of the first 2 competences, that is, communicating in the mother tongue and communicating in foreign languages. This division was deemed unhelpful, as children were growing up with multiple languages and were coming into our classrooms with different languages from the language of learning in the school. So we needed to develop they need to develop multilingual competence. Therefore, the first competency now is multilingual competence, and they need to pick up literacy of the countries that they're living in. So the second competence became literacy. And of course, in 2016, Silvana Richardson's memorable plenary, I'm sure you remember that, questioning the native and the non-native division, caused quite the furor and a sigh of relief. Finally, all teachers were worthy of the title English language teachers. Now, my first plenary was for TESOL Spain in the beautiful city of Vitoria-Gasteiz in the Basque Country. And it was about multilingualism and growing up with multiple languages. And at the end of that plenary, a teacher came up to me and she held my arm and she said, "Thank you. Now I know I'm not crazy." I was taken aback. But she had suddenly realized that mixing her languages, forgetting a word in one language and having to use the words from another language, having an accent in English, was actually quite normal. And that made me think about myself. I was born in South Africa, an English-speaking country, and have always been educated through English-speaking institutions. But I actually have another language hidden behind the sofa. I have Portuguese background, and until the age of 5, I spoke Portuguese. Sim, eu falei português, falo português. Hi, ladies. So what am I? Am I a native speaker? Or am I a non-native speaker? Well, who cares? I am a teacher with a complex, dynamic, rather mixed identity, like so many of our learners. So own your identity, display your identity as teachers, because the learners will benefit from it. And fast forward to 2021, the YLT SIG pre-conference event dedicated a full day to multilingualism, those movers and shakers. Even though we have, to a certain extent, accepted the use of the L1 in English, we need more research into understanding translanguaging in English language teaching. Because we need a better understanding of how to use all of our students' languages, not just the L1, whatever that may be, but using other languages in the classroom does not equate translating everything you say into the language of learning or simply teaching through that language. We need to move from the mother tongue or the L1 to integrating more linguistic diversity and understanding how English can enhance multilingualism and support the learning of English in young learner classrooms. In 2018, I joined academia and in Norway, and I was thrown right into a consultation process because Norway was in the process of reviewing their curriculum. And it's a beautiful curriculum. Look at all the wonderful words on there: identities and interculturality, multilingualism, sustainability. The curriculum calls us to help each student safeguard and develop their identity in an inclusive and diverse community. And all pupils shall experience that being proficient in a number of languages is a resource both in school and society. It states that pupils should be given a basis for seeing their own and others in multilingual and multicultural contexts. Language learning involves seeing connections between English and other languages as students know. Have you noticed the absence of the English-speaking countries? It was also urging us to move from learn or to know about to using words such as discuss, explore, reflect, which encourages more in-depth learning. And children's literature is mentioned in the English curriculum. But do we know how to do it? We need to learn how to use authentic children's literature without resorting to simply translating the story. We need to learn to deal with the intercultural domain without resorting to the surface-level comparisons across national borders, which erroneously equate cultures to those famous 5 Fs: food, famous people, festivals, folklore, and fashion. We need to teach citizenship education in the foreign language classroom that actually leads to action in the community. But how? We need to demonolingualize our curricula to integrate critical multilingual lens without resorting to translation. So these, as Kalaya and Piet Konen-Huchte has said, are wonderful, but they are all buzzwords. And these buzzwords are there because there is a dire lack of guidelines and concrete applications for teachers to be using this in the classroom. So if you're looking for something to research, these are areas that we still know very little about in primary and in pre-primary English. A steady stream of conference presentations, publications, such as edited volumes by Bland and Copland and Garton, journals such as the John Benjamin's Language Teaching for Young Learners, the Clearly Journal, which focuses on teaching children's literature in the English classroom, and by the way, it is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. Series such as the Early Language Learning in School Context series, which was set up, I think, in 2017 and now has already 7 titles. International or European or international projects such as the Erasmus Plus project ISPEL, which focuses on teaching children intercultural and citizenship education through picture books, and projects such as the Language Friendly School, which certifies schools that take active steps to respecting the languages of their learners. Websites, obviously, such as the British Council Learn English Kids and Teens, but the ECML, that is the European Centre for Modern Languages, with so many projects and research and resources for teachers, with a specific focus on early language learning, like the ILE project, but also on plurilingual practices and CLIL approaches, resources for teachers like teaching children how to learn, 500 activities for primary classrooms, and these books are winning prizes. And the latest to win an Elton in the category for innovation in teacher resources was a book focusing on pre-primary. Teaching English to pre-primary children, educating very young children. From Sandy Moran with Gail Ellis. So young learners are winning prizes, and that's a good sign. Well done. You can pat yourselves on the back for getting us here. And those children are on the sofa. They are out from behind the sofa. They're not just sitting on the sofa. They are jumping up and down. And they are visible and confident and gleefully enjoying their English language learning because they are getting some good English language teaching. So, has the Cinderella now taken her rightful place at the ball? Have we caught up with that horse? And have we reined it in? There is still one thing we need to do, because that sofa is still all wrong. It isn't the structure isn't right. It isn't robust enough for young language learners. The materials are inappropriate. It's getting frayed. And one size does not fit all. So what do? Do we resize the sofa? Do we reupholster the sofa? No, we get rid of the sofa. Oops, we need to move the sofa out of the slide. We get rid of the sofa, we call the movers, and we replace the sofa with cushions and puffs and forest trails and trampolines and intricately woven mats and picture books and make-believe. But where are we now in 2022? The world is a strange place. It is complex and fractured and divided. It is post-COVID, post-Black Lives Matter, post-Me Too, post-Trump, Brexit, post-globalized world. Well, I'm not quite sure it's post. I think we're still living through all this. And we are educating our children in this brave new world amidst a climate crisis, a geopolitical crisis, a democratic crisis, a refugee crisis. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees most recently estimated that by mid-2021, for the first time in recorded history, the number of people forcibly displaced was at 84 million. And what has teaching English to children got to do with these rather somber scenarios? Well, everything. Because educating the global citizens of tomorrow starts in primary and in pre-primary classrooms and requires 21st century skills. And English as a lingua franca, as an international language, as a cultural and linguistic subject, as a connecting language, is well placed to engage with these subjects. But English, all powerful, also has a heavy responsibility to ensure it is done in an equitable and humble manner, acknowledging children as learners in their own rights, sensitive to the diverse context where children are learning English, acknowledging the diverse identities of the children, teaching them to interact with a diverse world, helping them dealing with challenging subjects like the ones on the slide, instilling a love of nature and respect for difference, and that they too can make a difference. All this while we teach English. So as we board the train to continue our journey into pre-primary, have we learned to drive that train and navigate the terrain? The terrain we are now occupying is sensitive terrain in many ways. Firstly, provision for legal and free compulsory education in pre-primary, which encompasses age 3 to 6, is not universal. However, since 1999, there has been a general global upward trend in pre-primary enrollment in all regions and a steep rise in adoption of free and compulsory early childhood education and care between 2000 and 2015. The most recent UNESCO global study on the rights of pre-primary education, out of 193 national legal frameworks examined, 63 countries have adopted free pre-primary education, 51 countries have adopted pre-primary education at a compulsory level, and only 46 have free and compulsory pre-primary education. This is the most important life stage in our human existence, as it can harness the benefits of lifelong learning for all children. Even 1 year of pre-primary education preceding primary school can help children prepare for school in terms of acquiring foundational literacy and numeracy skills, and has a positive impact on academic, personal, and social achievements in later life. Yet it is the most neglected life stage of all. For example, in many countries, the education response to COVID-19 has neglected the pre-primary level to the advantage of older children. Given the importance of this developmental period, governments need to pay attention to ensure that early learning and the well-being of young children is given due consideration. At a macro level, we need to position our teaching of English within the wider frameworks such as the Education 2030 Framework for Action, which is underpinned by the Sustainable Development Goals, more notably the goal number 4, quality education, which calls for inclusive, equitable, and quality education focusing on age-specific interventions, child-centered pedagogies, safe and nurturing environments, and play-based learning. So where is pre-primary English in the scenario? Well, it's actually minute, officially. Of the learning areas investigated here, early foreign language learning is the least frequently mentioned in top-level educational guidelines, which is more targeted at the older learners. Yet it is exploding unofficially. So what do we do? At a micro level, and as the train reaches that final frontier, we need to be aware of the impact that we are having on children's development, because at no other level is the focus on the whole child more important. This life stage is also referred to by ECEC, so Early Childhood Education and Care. So have you noticed how we're shifting from teaching to care and development? So we need to enter that stage in our English language journey slowly, with care, and mindful of the needs of these young children in our care. And how are we doing on that front? I'm just going to use this example. Sandy Morang is concerned with this trickling stream that is very quickly becoming a rushing river, getting wider and deeper and stronger, and as it rushes towards the wide open sea, are we going to sink or swim? Well, there are some life buoys out there, thank goodness. It is reassuring. In 2019, Morang surveyed a number of presentations focusing on the early years, on pre-primary, here at the IATEFL Conference, with the code EY, which is based on the life stages reorganization of the YLT-SIG. And and Morin identified 42 sessions focusing on pre-primary, with peaks in 2014 and 2019. And as you can see from the graph, it is quite an erratic journey, but it does show a small increase in number of presentations. And furthermore, Morin was quite reassured that these sessions weren't just simply sharing practical tips and ideas and fun activities to entertain the children. These sessions were actually based on research in early language learning, which contributes to ensuring that this area of ELT is being taken seriously. And it is, to a certain extent. Because there is a steady increase in publications as well, that wholly and partly focused on early language learning in pre-primary. And here you have some examples. From 2014 onwards, the Murphy publication on second language learning in early school years, Morin and Lorenzo, early years second language education, the Murphy and Evangelou report, the early childhood education in English for speakers of other languages. 2020, not so long ago, Kirsch and Duarte looking at multilingual approaches for teaching and learning. And just last year, fresh off the press, Schwartz Handbook on Early Language Education. But this is not enough. We need to continue to investigate pre-primary contexts and fund more research in these early years. And particular attention needs to be paid to the broad development domains, such as the cognitive, language, socio-emotional, and physical domain, which demarcate the early childhood period from later development periods. We need to look at child-centered pedagogies, holistic curricula, and we need greater specificity in initial and in-service training. Because at no other level is the focus on the whole child more important than in pre-primary. So what do we do in order to reimagine and reinvent the early language learning? Well, I think it's actually very simple. We just go back to basics. Let's start with the child as a learning, developing, curious individual, as beings in the present time and in their specific contexts, and not just as adults in the making, as social actors in their own right, being changed by and changing their own environments. EU guidelines and some of the publications that I mentioned earlier, they recommend early language learning should not foster languages as separate subjects, but rather as communicative tools to be used in other activities and through other activities. A child's language skill is not separated from their mental growth. So we don't teach children, we don't teach English to the child, we teach the whole child through English. Let's start with children as linguistic geniuses, with the right to all their languages, but not as the natural sponges that learn languages by osmosis, because language learning is hard work, even for little ones, but as little scientists, with the ability to play with and hypothesize about language, as this little boy did in France. I walked into a classroom of 3 and 4-year-olds, and for some reason they started telling me all the languages they could speak. And I was quite surprised, and I thought, what do they understand? So I asked them, what is English? What is French? And this little boy, he clenched his fists, and he was all tense, and he was thinking really, really hard, and he went, English is green, and French is vert. Metalinguistic awareness in a 4-year-old. So developing English in multilingual contexts allows for an affirmation of identity through the support of other languages in the class, through rich language interaction, and print-rich environments. A translanguaging approach enhances children's awareness of and their willingness to experiment with English in these multilingual contexts. It gives children a voice or voices and foregrounds their personal language experience as valid, important, and relevant. Children can learn more than one language at the same time, simultaneously. And our languages are always activated in our brains. They are not necessarily blocked. So if I'm driving a car, speaking English to my son, Portuguese to my mother, French to my niece, I certainly hope my brain's not going to block out driving the car. It'll move. Nope. Oops. Sorry, this has got a bit. Let's start with children learning English in increasingly multicultural classrooms. Diversity is not out there, beyond our national borders. It's sitting right next to you in classrooms today, around the world. Let's move from a colour blindness to a colour conscious approach in our English classes. So we develop citizens of the world. I like this comparison. Husband compares the colour blindness to a colour consciousness approach to education, where dealing with issues of colour and race is something that you do explicitly. He exhorts educators to respond explicitly to individual racial differences in classrooms and schools in meaningful and substantive ways. So don't ignore the differences. Use quality language materials, and dare I suggest picture books that allow children to develop critical thinking and literacy by exploring not just the word, but the world, in the famous words of Paulo Freire. Their environment, as well as the environment with a capital E, that give children voice and agency. Now, learning is messy. It's erratic and recursive and spiraling and simultaneous and non-linear and complex. Occasionally it plateaus, then it peaks. Children in this messiness need color, art, movement, music, nature, so let them play. Stop testing them. Use observation and reflection techniques. Stop sitting them at desks. Get rid of the desks. Stop monolingualizing them. Use translanguaging approaches. Stop SLAing them. Look at the early childhood education and care curriculum in your context for inspiration and child development. Stop adultifying early language learning and use the philosophies of learning approaches such as Montessori, Reggio Emilia, Steiner, that are student-centered and that use self-directed experiential learning in relationship-driven environments. Stop clillifying them, because English should be integrated into the language routines or just the simple routines of everyday life in a child's life. Let them play. So, should we be worried of that while that young learner train entering pre-primary, entering that station? No, I don't think so. Not if we do it right. If learning is trans, let's make learning trans. Transcultural, translingual, transformative, transgressive. If we're going back to the basics, and if going back to the basics is transgressive, then be transgressive and go back to basics. So as that train pulls into the pre-primary station, I think I've changed the color scheme a little bit. I've gone from red to a little bit of yellow, not just because it's spring and we've got the daffodils out there, but as a sign of change. As we move from primary into pre-primary, we cannot assume that we can use primary approaches to teach 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. And I'd like to leave you with a message of kindness from a student in our IATEFL project. This is a project that they did based on the book Be Kind. And one of the activities was to write messages of kindness. And they went out into the community and handed out these messages to passers-by. And I happened to be passing by. And they gave me this message: give someone a flower. So let's drive that train into a well-looked after, generously watered and nurtured field of pre-primary flowers. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What a great start. Thank you very much. You're pointing us in the right direction.
I hope so.
We hope that you will attend the question and answer session later today if you're curious about Dr. Ibrahim's ideas. And I invite you all to just take a break, go to other sessions, have a wonderful conference. Thank you for being here today. Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you.